So thank you all very much for coming out tonight and for giving me this warm welcome. I'm Gillian Ahlgren. I'm a professor of theology at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, a Jesuit institution. I've been there for 26 years. And I first got started on this journey as a 19-year-old woman, unexpectedly visiting Montserrat outside of Barcelona in Spain. I didn't know what a monastery was. I didn't know what the Benedictine tradition was. I'd never heard of the Jesuits, and yet I was taken in many ways by both the natural beauty of the serrated mountains and by the orderliness, it seemed, of religious life in monastic community, and I was full of questions. And one question led to another question, led to another question, led to really a marvelous journey, step by step by step, since then. So our topic tonight is Keeping Love Alive, Communities of Care in the Spirit of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And I have a new book out that's called Enkindling Love, The Legacy of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. It's my 5th book, and I've never had a book launch. So this is as good as it gets. My teaching schedule keeps me very, very busy. I'll be teaching 6 weeks in Spain next month and through June, and then I'll be leading 2 groups of people on a spiritual immersion experience in Assisi, in the footsteps of Francis and Clare, in July. So this is about as good as a book launch is going to get, and I'm very glad to be able to use some of the material from this book tonight. We're ready. Oh, okay. All right, so we're ready for our second slide. This fire of love in you enkindles the souls of others. Can you hit it one more time, and we should get a nice little, there we go. And with every other virtue, you will be always awakening them. So says Teresa of Avila in the 7th dwelling places of her interior castle. So her understanding of the journey toward union with God is that we grow into relationship with God, a God who teaches us not only what love is, but how love is and what love does. She teaches us love as a verb, not just a noun. She teaches us God as a verb, not just as a noun. And she teaches us that partnership with God invites us into collaboration with God in the work of transformation. So not only are we changed, but then we become active collaborators, companions, and partners with God in the work of making the world a better place. Slide 3. Teresa of Avila, 1515 to 1582, and John of the Cross are 2 of Christianity's greatest mystical theologians and spiritual teachers. They introduce us to a God who is unfathomably generous, a God who longs for us with a heartbreaking fidelity and patience, a God who draws us into the work of making the world a place where everyone belongs, everyone is cherished, and everyone is accorded the innate dignity given to each human person. Teresa and John's God is actually keenly interested in us, surprising as that might seem to us, and has a shared knowledge of our challenges and struggles. That God is constantly gazing at us with eyes that anticipate, radiate, and elicit dignity, creativity, and courage. Teresa and John's legacy is as keenly relevant to our day as it was to their own time of turbulence and reform. So tonight I'd like to actually do a 2-part kind of presentation with hopefully enough time for question and answer, that we can look at the past and their context, what they experienced and accomplished in their day, and also at the present, how what they accomplished translates itself beautifully into a world of turbulence and even chaos today that might give us toeholds as we try to climb the ascent of Mount Carmel, climb the challenging mountain that leads us to a better place. Slide 4. Between the 2 of them, they wrote 8 major works and literally hundreds of poems, notes, counsels, and letters. How many of you have read one or more of Teresa's books? A few? How many of you have not? How many people have really no knowledge of Teresa and John? All right, then I'm glad that I've done this historical introduction at the beginning, because I hope that the way that I tell the story, I'm telling the story, I think, as a true church historian. That's my training, actually. I have a degree, my PhD is in the history of Christianity with a specialty in the Christian mystical tradition from the University of Chicago. And what I've always said is that good historians help theologians, and that you can't really be a great theologian without understanding the context in which theologians worked. Because to understand their context is to understand their significance. It's to understand what choices they could have made, and to understand what choices they did make and the significance of that. And so we begin to understand the significance of their theologies because we understand the context in which they live. So I'd like to tell their stories in such a way that even if you do know their stories, hopefully I'll be accentuating or helping you to see things that you've known about them in perhaps new ways. So between the two of them, they wrote 8 major works and literally hundreds of poems, notes, counsels, and letters. Teresa's correspondence is huge. It's massive. This outpouring of writing is only one expression of the creative abundance of God in their lives. That abundance played itself out in the formation of communities that mattered and that made a difference in the world around them. Their spiritual theological synthesis represents one of the greatest achievements of the Christian mystical tradition, and when we understand this synthesis within its historical context, Teresa and John emerge as people worthy of our most profound admiration for what they accomplished as human beings. Slide 5 will give us a sense of John's works. Teresa and John, I would argue, wrote primarily simply to help others. Their writing was a pastoral effort. Each of them had personally experienced God as a revolutionary source of vitality, capable of changing literally everything. As they dedicated themselves to partnership and collaboration with this God, they were determined to make the God they had known, the God who had so transformed their lives, accessible to as many people as possible. They were compassionate and dedicated contemplative teachers. They wrote for their companions on the way, knowing from their own personal experience where they might struggle, anticipating their needs, providing encouragement, and explaining how to continue on. They used simple yet evocative language, constantly self-critical, always pushing themselves to find words for the experiences that had helped them to see things that alone they would never have even thought possible. Slide 6. Although we might today initially turn to Teresa and John as guides who can help us find our way, their greatest gift to us is in outlining a process for us to discern the presence of God in our own lives. They help us to recognize and cling to what is most real, what matters most. We turn to them as spiritual teachers, and we end up being drawn into the grace at work in our own lives. In other words, we don't have to replicate their journey. We make use of their journey and their wisdom to understand ours. We find greater courage through them to take on the challenges that our own communities face. And we benefit from the joy of collaborating in something far greater than ourselves. This and more is what they teach us. So let's take a little look at their context and their own historical circumstances. Slide 7. In order to understand the boldness of Teresa and John's spiritual and theological synthesis, we have to locate them in the harsh times, tiempos recios, as Teresa called them, in which they lived. One of the major challenges they faced was the Spanish Inquisition's suspicion of interiority and mental prayer, which resulted in ongoing investigation and punishment of what were then called alumbrados. That was a pejorative term. Alumbrar means to illuminate. Lumbre is one of the words for light. It actually, luz is one and lumbre is another, and lumbre almost seems to connote a warmth and a fire and a aliveness to light. And so those who were alumbrados were illumined, but the Inquisition used this as a pejorative term to suggest that they had been falsely illumined and either were themselves deceived or they were actively deceiving others. So one of the major challenges they faced was the Spanish Inquisition's suspicion of interiority, which then resulted in an ongoing investigation and punishment of those people called alumbrados. Anyone teaching about spirituality, whether orally or in writing, was often subjected to intense scrutiny, and many books written on the inner life ended up on the Spanish indexes of prohibited books. The climate of 16th century Spain was literally like a minefield for people who, like Teresa and John, sensed the whisper of God to deeper personal authenticity. It is a testimony to their courage and tenacity that this rather inhospitable space for spiritual depth, not unlike our own today for different reasons, stimulated two of Christianity's greatest mystics and spiritual teachers to work harder at expressing God's love in authentically liberating ways. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that their works stand the test of time. So let's look at Teresa first a little bit, slide 8. Teresa was born in 1515 and she was raised in a blended family, we'd call that today. Her father had married twice, of 12 children, 2 by her father's first marriage. She lost her own mother when she was 12 years old, and shortly after that she was sent to live at the school associated with a local Augustinian convent. Teresa's father was a prosperous merchant, but the family's lack of pure blood, sangre limpio, limpieza de sangre, those were statutes that actually kept people who did not have Christian blood, but whose blood was tainted by Jewish origin from public office and indeed from many religious orders. So Teresa's paternal grandfather had converted to Christianity from Judaism and was prosecuted by the Spanish Inquisition. This kept Teresa's family from full integration either into old Spanish society or into careers of public service. So nearly all of her 9 brothers emigrated to the Americas, seeking fame and fortune. And it was actually the money that they acquired there that would later enable Teresa to begin her own reform movement. Slide 9. John of the Cross was born in 1542, the youngest of 3 children born to Gonzalo de Yepes from a wealthy family of silk merchants in Toledo. When Gonzalo married Catalina Alvarez, he was disowned. Gonzalo died when John of the Cross was only 3 years old, and the family struggled to survive. In fact, one of John's brothers died at the age of 8 of starvation. John found refuge in a school for orphans, and then when he was 17, he began to work at a hospital established to serve those suffering incurable diseases. Spotted and sponsored by one of the chaplains there, John attended the Jesuit college in Medina del Campo during the years 1559 to 1563. So it's a simple way of telling really the bare-bone facts of their lives, but you already get a sense of the precarity, especially of John's life, and the miracle that each one of them grew into who they became. Both Teresa and John seem to have joined the Carmelites almost by default, although it's worth noting that the Carmelites were one of the few religious orders in 16th century Spain that allowed people of converso origin to join them. Slide 10, let's take a look at the Convent of the Encarnacion, which Teresa joined and entered in November 1535. She spent 27 years there before leaving to found the Reformed Convent of San Jose in Avila in 1562. John joined the Carmelite order in 1563. He was ordained a priest in 1567 and crossed paths with Teresa for the first time that very same year, 1567. Slide 11. One of the things I find most noteworthy and instructive about these two was their complementarity. I think that there's a tremendous lesson for us to learn about their complementarity. And by that complementarity, I do mean male and female, but I also mean extrovert and introvert, and university educated and not. Those varying complementarities allowed them to draw out qualities in one another and help each other to grow. Neither one of them could have been who they became without the other. Before they began their work together, Teresa had struggled deeply to create a space for the new mystical way that they created together. So those of you who have read the book of her life, her spiritual autobiography, in it, Teresa describes the drama of her journey toward God. There are many, many moments in that drama, so I'm just going to list them here. She had severe illness as a young woman, which then led her to dedicate herself to the study and practice of prayer. She was bedridden. Then she struggled to find adequate spiritual direction, until gradually, with the help of Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises, she experienced the stabilizing influence of Jesuit spiritual direction and Ignatian meditative practice. She was also deeply formed by the Franciscan tradition and other books on prayer. She was very much self-schooled and a voracious reader. Then there was more controversy as her prayer life grew more intense, and she sought a lifestyle that would support her deepening relationship with God. A yearning for consistency, authenticity, and integration in her own life, and a communal space in which the true communio of the mystical life could be sustained. All of this turbulence bore fruit in the foundation of the first discalced Carmelite convent of San Jose in 1562, and there the freedom that she had to create and sustain with God and others the unitive life to which Teresa felt called. As Teresa reflects on these years of turbulence and contradiction in her life, she begins to recognize the hand of God in them, weaning her gently of all other authorities, whether those authorities were confessors, spiritual directors, or even spiritual books, so that she could learn directly from God, the fount of all wisdom. It seems to me now, she writes, that God provided where I could not find anyone to teach me. In other words, and this is deeply relevant to us today, Teresa was aware of the pedagogy of God that was at work in the struggles and growth and joys of her own life. She understood that God was alive, active, and actually seeking to teach her things through her own lived experience. That God wanted to share life with her, share in its challenges, rejoice in her growth, and empower her to a greater and deeper purposefulness in the world around her. Indeed, the more that life challenged Teresa, the more she sensed and sought the tender hand of God in, around, and through her life circumstances. Teresa's perspective on God here seems to mirror John of the Cross's description of the process of the dark night of the Spirit, where we must let go of all of our images of God and all of our assumptions about God, so that God can begin to reveal God's self to us directly on God's own terms, and so that we let go of lesser mediations of God's wisdom and power. As a result of this growing direct connection with God, both of them taught, we derive even greater strength and insight. So both Teresa and John experienced that as human beings, we tend to underestimate and even actively limit God, especially when we contain God or try to contain God in creeds or dogmas or rituals. Let's go to slide 12. Teresa and John sensed and knew, let's keep clicking it and see what happens. There we go. Let's try one more. Let's try one last one. There we go. All right, it was a very active slide. Teresa and John sensed and knew God's aliveness as a source of constant inspiration and creativity. Their God was always bubbling up and effervescent with loving activity. In a context in which religiosity tended to be measured in terms of attendance at Mass and conformity to church teaching, this emphasis on God's constant desire to come alive in us was disconcerting to some. But both Teresa and John retained actual concerns about spiritual directors and other experts hampering the direct communication of God and the soul. And these concerns were surely rooted in the lack of spiritual depth and experience of many of their contemporaries. In Teresa's case, these concerns instilled in her a resolve to protect others from the kind of pernicious doubt and second-guessing of God's grace and generosity that she had so often experienced because of the doubt of her confessors and guides. In other words, she began to internalize some of these doubts about who God was and whether or not God would truly bother with us and our lives. When Teresa and John met for the first time in Medina del Campo, Teresa was finalizing the foundation of the second Reformed convent of the Discalced Carmelite order, and she was just beginning to imagine that this small community of life-giving love that she had so wanted might begin to be an epicenter of something more that might spread. So she was beginning to imagine more of these small, contemplative communities that her new constitutions called for. And in particular, she wanted a community of men to be part of the reform, especially because then she and her sisters would have priests and confessors who were themselves well formed in the mystical life. John at that time was seeking greater solitude than the Carmelite tradition was offering him. He was even considering a transfer to the Carthusian order. Although the two were of very different temperaments, it did not take them long to recognize their similar vision, passion, determination, and longing. It was an intense yearning to bring the searing love of God into the world that brought them together in 1571 in Avila. By then, Teresa had been appointed prioress of the large and still unreformed convent of the Encarnacion that we saw before. Very aware of the convent's dynamics, Teresa took on the task of being the prioress of that convent with trepidation. One of her first decisions was to bring the kindly, wise John, not yet 30 years old, to serve as the convent's spiritual director. So let's go back. I think it's almost the same slide of the Encarnacion. So keep going forward. I embedded slide 13. Oh, there we go. So this is now inside the Encarnacion. Teresa was certain that John's care and spiritual encouragement of the sisters at the Encarnacion would inspire greater thirst for and commitment to the mystical life. The move was a brilliant one. Slide 14. As Teresa already knew, you cannot begin to recollect yourselves by force, but only by gentleness if your recollection is going to be more continual. Well, you couldn't have found a gentler person than John of the Cross. As one of the sisters at the Encarnacion later recalled of John, he had a gift for consoling those who came to him by his words and in the notes that he used to write to us. So let's look at slide 15, which is actually one of John's sketches, and it's still there in the Encarnacion. He must have given this sketch to one of the sisters. Okay, let's see, we've got 9 right here. This time period of the mid-1570s at the Encarnacion represents one of the Christian tradition's greatest and most deliberate collaboration between two great mystics. They established a true school for the mystical life at the Encarnacion. Let's look at slide 16, which then enabled Teresa to dispatch women. Look at this, 1562 to 1582. It's only 20 years. This active pace of almost one convent per year by mule, let's just remember, right? By mule. They established a true school for the mystical life at the Encarnacion, which then enabled Teresa to dispatch formed and prepared women all across Spain. For Teresa, too, personally, these were years, the 1570s, of significant growth in the mystical life. Insights that she could not yet articulate when she wrote the book of her life in 1562 were becoming clearer and more comprehensible as her unitive life with God grew more integrated and sustained. It was precisely in the years between 1572 and 1577 that she began to live continually in a realized partnership with God and a radiant participation in the Trinitarian life, as the order also thrived. And so she set out to write a comprehensive guide for others seeking this kind of creative flourishing in partnership with God. Her interior castle, written in 1577, superseded theologically her earlier writings and has since become one of Christianity's great spiritual classics. And so in our workshop tomorrow, we'll explore a bit of what the interior castle does. All of this flourishing triggered strong resistance, right? I always think to myself, when the resistance comes, I must be doing something right. In November 1577, literally 3 days after Teresa had finished writing her interior castle, John of the Cross was violently kidnapped by his non-reformed brothers in religious life. Taken from Avila to Toledo, he spent 9 months in captivity. We're ready for slide 17. Where flogging and severe mental torture turned his world inside out. The fact that he survived is remarkable enough. The fact that this experience somehow helped crystallize for him the reality of God's tenderness and loving care is testimony both to his maturity as a human being and to something core, essential, and powerful about the capacity of God to communicate to us in our darkest hours. Slide 18. His most brilliant poetry, the spiritual canticle, a love song between the soul and God, was born in this space of darkness. Teresa, from outside the prison cell, responded to John's kidnapping with shock, horror, and direct advocacy. She immediately did everything she could to locate and rescue him, appealing to religious and secular authorities to intervene in a situation that cried out for adjudication and remediation. More privately, in a letter to one of her closest friends and collaborators in the Reform, Maria de San Jose, Teresa revealed not only her indignation at the injustice of the events, but her personal sorrow and distress, feeling deeply the specific details of what had happened. And so here's how we get a little bit of insight into what actually happened to John. John and his companion Germán de San Matías had been lashed several times and violently treated. When the two were taken away, the Sisters of the Encarnación said that Germán, at least as they saw it, was bleeding through the mouth. Teresa begged Maria de San Jose for her prayers, both for her sisters, who suffered the loss, and for the two, as she called them, holy prisoners. And her language indicates that she is keenly aware of the suffering of her friends John and Germán. In her ongoing correspondence with Maria over the next months, Teresa keeps vigil. She actually marks time from the day that the two were seized. For example, she writes, "Tomorrow will make 8 days that they have been imprisoned." And in another letter she says, "For although today makes 16 days since our two brothers were imprisoned, we do not know if they have released them." This marking of time in terms of John's disappearance recalls, for me at least, the vigils of the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina during the years of the junta. And it points in part to the tradition of prophetic witness and advocacy that Teresa and the mystical life more generally calls us to. Far from removing us from the concerns and injustices of the world around us, intimacy with God sensitizes us to the reality of God incarnate in the world. Oh, thank you. I see you nodding with me. I'm glad that we're all together in this. It stirs a deep desire in us to cherish that presence, and it makes us feel quite keenly the indignities and injustices in our world, since they indicate humanity's active disdain at God's own presence in our midst. For the next 6 months, Teresa used all means possible to advocate for the release of John of the Cross. She wrote to King Philip himself, King Philip II himself, as well as several bishops and the leadership of the Carmelite order, trying to reach all who might be able to influence, compel, and bring to justice the Cals brothers who had imprisoned him. Despite her efforts, John remained in prison until, ojo, as they'd say in Spanish, attention, watch, note this. Despite her efforts, John remained in prison until he himself escaped from his cell in August 1578. So he was never released. We sometimes think of John as passive, And what's very interesting is that no, he knew that what was happening to him was unjust, and in his own way, he resisted it. When he arrived at the convent of the Discalced Sisters in Toledo, he was so emaciated that they hardly recognized him. Learning of his treatment in more detail, Teresa expressed her shock in a letter to Jerónimo Gracián, asking him to inform the papal nuncio of the entire situation. So here again we see both Teresa's righteous indignation and her conviction that bringing darkness and injustice into the light is a service both to God and to God's people. Teresa's actions provide a clear example of the prophetic dimensions of contemplative life. As for John, although he was widely criticized for passivity and even quietism in the years after his death, it should be instructive to us that he courageously, even stealthily, found the means to escape from captivity. This would have required him to unbolt the padlocked door, measure the distance from the monastery window down the cliffs to the city wall below, fashion a sturdy enough rope from strips of blanket and what remained of his clothing, get down the rope under cover of night, and make his way painfully to the Discalced convent across town. Both his poem, The Dark Night, and the spiritual canticle were born in this pitiful moment of John's life, although it would take him months to recover physically and emotionally from this experience, and only in subsequent years could the poetry and its beautiful commentary make their way to writing. Okay, let's take a breath. That's the story. Yes? Does it fill you with any quick insights? Quick noticings? They're remarkable people. And they're empowered people. I think they show the desire of God to empower us, to turn us into, to help us to become people of strength, conviction, and yet gentleness, tenderness for one another, care, investment in one another, deep investment. Investment in what each other's struggles are, and in the potential that's embedded in one another, and in the process that we engage to grow toward that potential. So let's move their story into our story a little bit more. Teresa and John spoke of God with power and authority. People who listened deeply to what they taught were changed. The fact that their teachings generated strong, even violent resistance from some who rejected the reforms they called for is likely another indication of both the authenticity of their message and how compelling their understanding of God and the mystical life really was. The depth and substance of their teaching, its subjective richness, and its capacity to resonate with readers across time and space give us new eyes to understand our own reality. Over the 25 years that I've been teaching this material, I started when I was 10. Just kidding. Just kidding. Over the 25 years that I've been teaching this material, it is a source of encouragement and consolation to me to see how it creates possibilities for generations of people to integrate human experience with an active sense of the movement of the divine within and around us, whatever that is. And we will have time, I hope, for some question and answer afterward. I hope that you'll stay for that. So I'm just going to embed, in case I don't get too much of a time to talk about it, and in case this part particularly interests you, you can ask more about it. But on Friday, I have to say this because I feel like it's an accomplishment at many, many levels. Not a personal accomplishment, an accomplishment of the community. But this past Friday, I was able to facilitate the very, very first day of renewal for domestic violence survivors in Birmingham. Through the Freedom Program, an accompaniment program that works with survivors of domestic violence to empower them and help them move on to much better ways of life. And I used very deeply and meaningfully, I think, Teresa's teachings on the soul, the garden of the soul, and on using work from the interior castle. And it truly, truly spoke to the women, but also the women spoke to it. And it's women like these that continue to teach me the significance and meaning of Teresa's works. In a culture that is as superficial as ours so often is, Teresa and John not only invite us to the depth and richness of life, but they also help people, I'm using my friend Ian Matthews' words here, help people connect with the vitality concealed in what is already there, unquote. If today's shortage of depth is intellectual, moral, and spiritual, it is also simply human. Indeed, there is a general confusion about what it means to be human, and of what truly matters, and of how to live a meaningful life despite the chaos of an age in which there is simply too much information, too much data to sort through. This makes an insight like John's very simple: it was for this goal of love that we were created, unquote. A vital truth that has the capacity to pierce through the blur of our daily lives with a kind of light that brings hope and the possibility of change. What Teresa and John make clear to us is that we are, each of us, created for union with God. Nothing less than that will satisfy us. We yearn for lives that make sense in the light of love, and therefore we cannot be satisfied by anything less than the source of light and love. What is more, and what is even more amazing, is that this powerful longing within us is only the smallest echo of a far deeper longing in God for us. As Ian Matthew puts it so beautifully in a commentary on John's Living Flame of Love, quote, "The work pulses with God's eagerness to belong to other persons." Teresa and John teach us God's deep generosity, God's constant self-giving. They show us a self-communicating God, a God whose plan is to fill us with nothing less than God. Indeed, as Matthew writes, John's universe is drenched in a self-outpouring God. Well, couldn't our universe use that as well? This is not always how John has been understood. In fact, his prose seems studded with austerity, and many would point to how often John counsels readers to aspire to, literally, nada, nothing. A desire to cling to nothing in life other than God. This makes nada, not nothing, but a spatial, relational reality, a replacement of the smallness of the self with the fullness that union and collaboration with God brings. And in order to reach such complete union, the desire for the unitive life must take full sway in a person's life. Our high destiny, according to John, is the aspiration to a love equal to God's. Indeed, we have always desired this equality, naturally and supernaturally, for lovers cannot be satisfied if they fail to feel that they love as much as they are loved, unquote. That's from the Spiritual Canticle. As our experience of God's love intensifies, so does our desire for full consummation of this love, a goal which would seem impossible if that loving desire were not the very seed of God planted within us. As Teresa and John both teach, the image of God, if we dedicate ourselves to cultivating it, will burn its way through our being until we too are part of the living flame of love that fires all life. In an age in which people are weary and even jaded, dubious and hesitant to invest themselves in anything, Teresa and John's confidence in the power of desire, rightly ordered and intensely focused, can provide a hopeful and helpful path toward joy and fulfillment. Rather than cutting off desire and clipping our wings, Teresa and John teach us that love asks us to soar higher than we could hope. As Ian Matthew writes, and this is apropos to kind of moving ourselves into a survival mentality, which is so easy for us to do as human beings. Survival demands a certain skepticism. This is Ian, not me. We are trained to cope as social beings by keeping our desires within realistic limits. But where God is concerned, the problem lies in our desiring too little. And growing means expanding our expectations, or rather, making God's generosity, not our poverty, the measure of our expectations. Isn't that great? When the goal of loving as God loves us seems impossible, John does not suggest that we settle for something more manageable. He agrees that the goal is distant, and he says that desire will get us there. Thus, as Ian Matthew argues about John, and it is equally true of Teresa. Indeed, this reality is critical to understanding the source of Teresa's own profound humility and gratitude, which often strikes the reader of Teresa. John never backs down from his statement of divine generosity. Teresa and John remind us, too, of the power of love to motivate. They give us a lover's eagerness to love, to serve, and simply to be there for others, to be a trustworthy presence for love to grow in our world. They help us rise to the occasion of a love that holds us accountable to our own capacity for goodness, and that asks us to incorporate all of our gifts and talents into a daily practice of generous self-sharing. Additionally, they remind us that we cannot give what we do not have, that we should humbly acknowledge and address our own need for the constancy of God's loving energy that will then empower us with the vision, insight, strength, and purpose that we and the world we inhabit need. Teresa and John give us criteria for assessing the quality of our lives, and even more importantly, for discerning the depth and reality of our lives. They understand that we live in a world that is swarming with multiple sources of authority, and yet with very little that is true, lasting, trustworthy, or meaningful. They demonstrate convincingly that authentic, life-giving love is the only foundation strong enough to provide the support we need. And they show us that even this foundation will shift like sand until we anchor it completely and thoroughly in our love relationship with God. They teach us that our days, which so often fill themselves with whatever comes, can instead be punctuated by the very breath of God, drawing us into fullness of life in a space of tenderness that whispers the truths by which we aspire to live. Today, 500 years after Teresa's birth, and with more interest in Teresa and John than ever, we are just now coming into the creative possibilities that their spiritual theological synthesis holds. For too long we have been kept from apprehending and applying it to our day and age. In fact, if we continue to cling to some of the binaries, theological versus spiritual, or even spiritual versus religious, intellectual versus affective, contemplative versus apostolic, Catholic versus Protestant, we're always sorting ourselves out along divisions. What is that? But those binaries have characterized our approaches thus far, and so we really are poised, and we need a very careful dialogue that will help us to stretch toward the God that Teresa and John knew, the one who is beyond name, yet who tenderly calls us out of ourselves and wants to hold us in an embrace of unfathomable kindness. Ultimately, it is God's self-revelation as lover and as companion who is constantly surprising us with consolation and delight, humbling us with immense attentiveness, wanting to come alive in us and in our world that we stand to lose if we do not heed the teachings of Teresa and John. And this would be at least as much of a pity, as Teresa says, as that we do not understand ourselves, nor do we know who we are. In fact, that's her lament at the beginning of her interior castle. Since for both of them, God was experienced as the single compelling energy capable of providing meaning and direction, no matter what dissonance life meted out. As we look out upon a world grown even more chaotic than ever, their understanding both of the divine and of human nature is more critical than ever. If Teresa and John show us that we are created by and for love, they also show us that such love is radically practical, not theoretical, not abstract, not formed in our imagination as we consider what we might do, but rather measured in terms of what we actually do. Love is never idle, Teresa reminds us, and such a failure would be a very bad sign. Their insistence that love is fruitful parallels Pope Francis's reminder to the Christian community as a whole in his Joy of the Gospel, when he writes, "We know that God has taken the initiative and has loved us first. Therefore, we should, quote, boldly take the initiative, go out to others, seek those who have fallen away, stand at the crossroads and welcome the outcasts, because God wants us to be fruitful. What might this look like? To use Teresa's yardstick, any statement or act of faith would have to inspire a more intentional and thoughtful love in others. The quality of our faith, as well as the quality of our humanity, and maybe there'd be two sides of the same coin, right? We wouldn't say that faith is any different than our humanity. The quality of our faith, as well as the quality of our humanity, would be measured in terms of our capacity to enkindle love. That is, to participate in and diffuse new life in a dying world, like the phoenix, who, all burnt up, rises from the very same ash. Teresa and John remind us that the point, not just of faith, but also of being human, is to be drawn into loving activity, godly activity. Oh, we're behind a few slides, I think. Through our relationship with the divine. Let's see where we are. There we are. We're called into relationship with God that not only transforms us, but also draws us into a whole vital process of godly activity, far bigger than our own individuality, so that, too long, with God, we become part of the work of renewing the world, working for dignity, renouncing and denouncing sin and injustice, growing in truth and love and fidelity, and drawing others into this life-giving, creative activity. This is all godly activity. It's loving activity. They're one and the same. Not only are we transformed by that relationship with God and others, as if that itself would not be enough, but we are drawn into this work. Notice that their model here is not one of self-emptying and self-depletion, but one of radiant overflow. We seek to be filled with a love that overflows and pours forth into the world around us. It is not what the self does at all. It is what God does in and with us, in the measure that we open ourselves to the deepening movement of God within us and through us. Not only is this counsel one that liberates us, or hopefully can liberate us, from burnout and from the delusion that we can do all things, it also frees us from the clutter of things that are not worthy of our attention, so that we can love with greater depth, intensity, creativity, and delight. As Ian Matthews so cogently describes, to step free from enslavement, we need a love which fills us at the point that enslaving loves have filled us. To transcend our mediocrity, we need a love which touches us at the threshold of our fear. John presents a God whose love does that. Stepping into this wellspring of God's love gives us an interior impulse which encourages, motivates, nourishes, and gives meaning to our individual and communal activity, and that enjoins us to recover, as a people in need of conversion, a new and universal solidarity. For Teresa and John, this solidarity is learned, as Peter Hans Kolvenbach, former Minister General of the Society of Jesus, once put it so saliently, that solidarity is learned through contact, not concepts. There, Teresa and John's primary contact was an intimate friendship with Christ, discovered as they allowed Christ's own vulnerability to embolden them to be better friends to Christ. As Teresa put it in her life, it seemed to me that I did better when I approached Christ in the places where I saw him more alone. For it seems to me that being alone and afflicted, like a person in need, he might let me in. In particular, I found the place of his prayer in the garden very helpful. That is where I went to keep him company." Unquote. Such experiences of prayer convinced Teresa of the divine commitment to solidarity with us, and sensitized her to the Incarnation as a reality of solidarity in which she too could live. Teresa's example becomes a useful one, especially if we can layer that understanding of Christ's own vulnerability when we engage more directly the need of the suffering Christ in others who are alone and vulnerable. Attending to Christ, responding, that is, to Christ's plea in the garden to stay with me, is emphatically not simply an internal practice. We live in a world in which people are continually trampled down, needing accompaniment, and to attend to Christ in that way is a critical prayer practice. As Teresa herself says, "It benefits me little to be by myself and very recollected, making acts of devotion to God, proposing and promising to do wonders in God's service, if, when I leave that space and an occasion to serve offers itself to me, I do everything the opposite." Unquote. Friendship and constancy and vulnerability become a bridge to knowing the presence of God in the human community. Again, the idea is not choosing between contemplation and action, but to find the growing consistency and coherence between the two. For in attending to the presence of Christ by turns, in solitude and in engagement, we gain increasing clarity that we are quite literally accompanied by God in our daily life, even as our desire to accompany others faithfully grows within us. So, as we have seen, one element of the legacy of Teresa and John's message is that it demonstrates the inherent coherence of contemplation and prophetic witness. To appreciate Teresa and John, especially as together they create a whole new movement of spiritual practice, is to recognize how a contemplative life takes form and shape in the world. Indeed, that taking form and shape is in itself a prophetic act, a unique witness to the reality that God can be incarnated in our very midst as we grow into our partnership with God and bring it into the full range of our lives in the world and in the relationships that we have with others. So in theological terms, I have to do this because I'm a paid theologian, it is participation in the incarnation. And as both Teresa and John clearly teach, radical solidarity with Christ gradually becomes the point of entry into the life of the Trinity, which is not an abstraction. It's the movement, the constant movement, the perichoresis, the divine dance of God and God's love into the world. That is the source of that outpouring. So if Christ is the living space opening up for us relationship with God, this is a relational way of living. An invitation, then, to life in the Trinity. The paradigm, this is taken from my Entering Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle book. Sometimes you kind of get it right, or you think you do, and so you say, better not reinvent the wheel. The paradigm that Teresa explores is how the fullness of union with God endows the soul with strength. Over the course of repeated experiences of such union, the soul comes into its deepest potential, which is not of its own nature as an individual, but it is within its growing nature as a partner and collaborator of God. This is, in other words, our potentiality in and with God, all hyphens. And as Teresa writes, from this union comes our fortitude. This union gives us aspirations and love that we know are far beyond what we ourselves can generate. Through these aspirations, Teresa says, the soul understands clearly that it is God who gives life to our soul. These aspirations come very, very often in such a living way that they can in no way be doubted. Both Teresa and John are deeply concerned about the kind of person one becomes through relationship with God. This is not merely a moral question having to do with growth in virtue. Nor do Teresa and John frame their concerns in terms of identity. They are far more concerned about the recovery of the image of God in us. And as they would understand this process, I think they would see it in terms of a vivification of that image. It's not a static image of God that resides in us. It's a living image that gives us life. Teresa and John's God, and I would hope ours too, is a living God, and therefore a God who constantly gives new life, new possibility to all. God is a constant source of both identity and life, an identity that is maybe borrowed at first, or maybe better, grown into relationally. It's an identity that is grown in us over time through the progression of our intimacy with God, our honesty about who we are, and our authenticity, our movement and commitment to authenticity. Ultimately, this is an incarnational restoration, the self-realization of the human person in consummated love relation with God. When we know and understand ourselves as relational, and when that relationality is grounded in our relationship with God, we grow into a capacity to collaborate with God, to actualize a genuine and living partnership with God that is constantly teeming with life. Or as Teresa puts it above, she's always birthing, it is always birthing good works. Thus, the mystical life is an invitation to us to be active partners in the work of bringing new life into the human community. This partnership bears fruit very concretely in imagination, in creativity, in seeing and implementing possibilities, in all of what we typically associate with visionary leaders who move things from ideas into reality and to support and contribute to personal and social transformation. Another critical application of this process of transformation is necessary for life in our world today. If Teresa and John, and this is where the heart of my own work is, the basic insight, the basic premise is that if Teresa and John have in fact captured a process that enables transformation, their same principles are quite applicable for identity reformation after one's identity has been shattered by trauma. And so that's part of what has led me to use these teachings and these insights in my work with people through the Ignatian Spirituality Project. Can we go to a few last slides? The Ignatian Spirituality Project, here's one example of, we do about 6 retreats per year overnight with women in recovery from substance abuse who are formerly homeless. And we teach them basic principles and spiritual practices. And what I love about this picture is, can you see how, oops, that's all right. Let's just go back to that. Can we go back one more? We had only been together by that point for about 12 hours. But everyone wanted. Can you see the tenderness? I mean, there was a closeness that was generated and that was experienced and that was very, very real and that none of us will ever forget. And this is, in my sense, in my lived experience, this is an example almost of those moments of the tender touch of the divine hand that begin to be inscribed in us. And if we have moment after moment after moment, they have the capacity to teach us and show us a way of life that we're quite capable of in and with God. So there's the Ignatian Spirituality Project and my work with women in recovery after domestic violence. So another critical application, I've only got one more page, promise. Another critical application of this principle of transformation is necessary for life in our world today. If Teresa and John provide us with a way of moving toward the identity that God extends to us as God's beloved, they offer us trustworthy tools for identity formation in a time in which we are vulnerable to all kinds of false information about who we are, what we want, what we need, and where we are going. Perhaps the most hopeful application of Teresa and John's theology of transformation is its capacity to provide a viable path toward post-traumatic identity reformation. That's really what I'm exploring now. The same tools that are capable of helping us form an identity in more or less neutral terrain, it's never neutral out there, is it? But are capable of helping us form a new identity when the old one has been shattered by trauma. If you go forward 3 or 4 more slides, you'll see a beautiful expression. This is the one, yes. So this is a 7-layered piece that is one of many that was made as a community art project by the women of House of Peace, which is an intentional living community for survivors of domestic violence outside of Chicago in the United States. So this is their 2nd year anniversary art project, and you can see it's taken directly from one of the workshops that I did with the women on Teresa of Avila. This is the quote from Teresa's interior castle: "Let us remember that within us there is a palace of immense magnificence." And what they did was they actually started, I may as well take you through the whole thing, right? They started with burlap, rough outer covering, right? And each layer here, there are 7 of them, so 7 layers or 7 dwelling places in the interior castle. The last layer is the diamond or the jewel in the very, very center of the soul or of the human person. And so each one of the women who did the workshop that I facilitated, then ended up with one of these as a simple reminder. So Teresa and John provide legitimate categories for establishing what is truest and most reliable on the basis of what is rooted in dignity and incarnational presence. When life circumstances or human relations shatter our capacity to recognize that dignity, especially in ourselves, Teresa and John offer us a programmatic way of regaining ownership of that dignity and claiming for ourselves and others an identity rooted in a love that constantly acknowledges and cherishes our dignity. The integrity of the divine human partnership that Teresa and John teach is an integrity with the capacity to bind together the fragments not only of the self, but of brokennesses in the human community as they are seen and known in the light of the presence of God. Teresa and John teach us that authentic theology is always and seeks always to be practical, to transform, to move things toward the greater good, toward the perfection of all things, not as perfect forms in and of themselves, but in some kind of mysterious communion in which each thing has its rightful place, even as nothing is whole in and of itself. All is known in relationship, a relationship that constantly challenges and accompanies us in the work of becoming. Teresa and John's legacy is the gift of accessibility. They make themselves radically accessible to us. Isn't that what you were saying, John, before we started, right? That you read Teresa's books and you feel like you know Teresa. They make themselves accessible to us as writers, spiritual guides, and companions. They make God accessible to us, and they make ourselves accessible to us. They teach us that we ourselves are desirable. We ourselves are capable of collaborative partnership. They teach us that by opening ourselves, and making ourselves accessible to the transforming love of God in ongoing and deepening ways, we are drawn into the love that gives life. Endowed with the capacity to love, each of us, no matter what our station, can be empowered in that love to enkindle love in others and to rejoice in the fruits of new life that we see as we do so. Thank you. Sorry.